The year is 1878. The month is November. A wind that carries the teeth of the coming winter blows down from the peaks, scouring the last of the brown leaves from the valley floor. The air smells of iron and ice. An 18-year-old girl named Audra Mills stands on a patch of frozen earth that is no longer hers. In her hand, she holds a single, dirt-caked potato, its skin rough against her palm. It is the last thing she took from the ground. The cold has made her fingers stupid, but she does not drop it. Across from her, the town storekeeper, Mr. Hemlock, pulls his coat tighter. He does not look at her. He looks at the exhausted fields, at the small, empty cabin behind her. He is a man made of ledgers and straight lines, and this girl is a problem he has just solved. "Your father's foolishness died with him," he says, the words leaving his mouth as small, white clouds. The ground is for corn, not dreams. He turns and walks away, his boots making a sound like breaking bones on the hard-packed trail. She is left with an old black horse, a canvas sack containing 2 of her father's books, and the single potato. If you have ever felt the world shrink to the size of what you can carry, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We are about to enter a cave that holds more than just stone. Audra's father had not been a farmer. He was, in his own quiet way, a scholar of the soil. While the other men in Providence Gulch planted corn and beans, the same crops their fathers had planted, Daniel Mills planted questions. He sent away for agricultural pamphlets from universities back east, strange documents full of charts and talk of nitrogen and crop rotation. He read them at night by candlelight, his finger tracing lines of text that held, for him, a kind of scripture. His neighbors saw a man wasting good lamp oil on theories when he should have been mending his fence. His obsession was the potato. To the people of the Gulch, it was a root vegetable of last resort, something to fill the belly when the corn ran low. It was unreliable, prone to rot in the damp cellars and frost in the shallow ones. But Daniel saw something else. He saw a dense package of nutrition, a plant that asked for little and gave back much, if only one could solve the problem of its keeping. He believed the answer was not in a cellar dug from damp earth, but in the earth itself, in the constant, deep-down cool of the mountains. He spoke of limestone caves, of dry air and a temperature that never wavered, winter or summer. He talked about it to anyone who would listen, which was almost no one. The community did not have a category for a man like Daniel Mills. He was not lazy, but his work produced no visible surplus. He was not unintelligent, but his intelligence was spent on dirt. Audra grew up in the shadow of this gentle dismissal. She learned to read from his pamphlets and to count by measuring rows of potato plants. She learned that a question was a more useful tool than a shovel, because the right question told you where to dig. The other children learned catechism. Audra learned the difference between 7 varieties of potato. The other women learned to preserve beans in salt. Audra learned how to identify blight on a leaf. Mrs. Gable, who lived on the next claim over, once watched Audra spend an entire afternoon mapping the sun's path across their small field. She later told her husband, loud enough for Audra to hear, "A girl can't live on dirt apples and book learning." It was not meant to be cruel. It was simply the observable truth of their world. In Providence Gulch, you were what you produced, and the Mills family produced theories. Then the pneumonia came for her father in October. It was swift and merciless, a thief that took the breath from his body and the warmth from their cabin. Audra was left with his horse, Shadow, his books, and a debt at Mr. Hemlock's general store that she could not pay. The debt was not large, but it was absolute. Mr. Hemlock was not a cruel man. He was a practical one. The land was collateral. The debt was due. The foreclosure was a simple matter of arithmetic. He took the cabin, the fields, the tools. He left her the horse out of something that might have been pity, and the books because he saw no value in them. He left her standing on the edge of her own life, with winter coming on. That was how she found herself with nothing but a horse, 2 books, and a single potato, listening to the sound of Mr. Hemlock's footsteps fading down the trail. She did not go toward the town. The town had made its judgment clear. She turned Shadow toward the mountains, the great, silent wall of rock and pine that framed their valley. Her father had always looked to the mountains not as an obstacle, but as an answer. He had spoken of a specific kind of geology, of limestone formations that created dry, stable caves. He had marked a potential area on a hand-drawn map tucked inside one of his books. It was a fool's hope, a destination drawn from a dream. It was all she had. The first 3 days were a study in the body's slow surrender to cold. The temperature dropped with every 100 feet of elevation she gained. The wind found every seam in her worn coat. At night, she would find a rock overhang, build a small, smoky fire, and huddle with Shadow for warmth, the great, dark bulk of him a comfort against the pressing dark. They shared the last of her bread. Then there was nothing. Hunger began as an ache, then became a hollowness, then a kind of dull static in her mind that made thinking difficult. She chewed on pine needles for the faint taste of vitamin C, a trick her father had taught her. Her fingers, which had been burning with cold, went numb. She would look down at them and see them as pale, foreign things that belonged to someone else. The shivering started, a deep, uncontrollable tremor that shook her teeth in her skull. At first, she welcomed it. Shivering was the body's fire, a sign it was still fighting. Then, it became exhausting, a constant drain on what little energy she had left. She began to crawl to the stream for water, the world tilting and swaying with dizziness. On the 5th night, she lay in the dark under a thin blanket, the snow falling in silent, heavy flakes around her. She thought about giving up. She thought about Providence Gulch, about the warmth of Mrs. Gable's kitchen, the smell of baking bread, the thick oatmeal she had always hated. It seemed like the most wonderful food imaginable now. She could go back. She could knock on Mr. Hemlock's door. She could beg. She could offer to work as a scullery maid, a servant, anything for a roof and a bowl of soup. This was where her story could end, a small, frozen shape found in the spring thaw. It would be a sad story, but not an surprising one. The potato fool's daughter, come to a predictable end. Something pulled her back. It was not a miracle. It was a sentence from one of her father's books, a line she had read a dozen times without understanding its weight. The earth provides for what the earth requires. It was not a prayer. It was a statement of fact. Her body required shelter. The earth would provide it. The thought was a practical problem that demanded an immediate solution. It cleared the fog from her mind. She sat up. The shivering had almost stopped. That was a bad sign. She knew that much. The body was giving up its fight. She got to her feet, leaning on the horse. She had to move. Now. She followed a game trail, barely visible in the moonlight, stumbling through the new snow. She was not looking for a miracle. She was looking for a dark spot against the white, an overhang, a fissure, anything that broke the wind. And then she saw it. Not a small overhang, but a proper opening in the rock face, a dark mouth partly hidden by a curtain of ancient junipers. It was exactly where her father's map had suggested it might be. She pushed through the branches, her heart a cold, tight knot in her chest. The air that flowed out of the opening was still. It was not warm, but it was not the biting, active cold of the outside. It was a neutral cold, a deep, unchanging 50 degrees. She stepped inside. The floor was dry, sandy earth, not mud. The walls were smooth, pale limestone. The cave went deep, far deeper than she could see. She walked a few paces into the absolute black, and the sound of the wind vanished. The silence was total. It was a living thing. She took a breath. The air did not burn her lungs. She did not feel relief. Relief is an emotion for people who have been rescued. She felt something else, something she had no word for. It was recognition. She had come home to a place she had never been. She dropped to her knees on the cold, dry floor. She had not been rescued. She had arrived. The earth had provided. Now, she was required to build. The work began with the most basic of needs, a place to sleep that was not the cold ground. Within the vast mouth of the cave, she chose a section set back from the entrance, protected from any errant draft. Here, she would build her cabin, a house inside a house. Her tools were meager. A hatchet her father had favored, its handle worn smooth by his hands. A small bucksaw. A hammer with a chipped handle. These she had managed to tuck into Shadow's saddlebags. She gathered fallen timber from the slopes below the cave. Deadfall pine and aspen, dry and seasoned by the mountain air. Each log was a battle. She would cut it to length, then drag it, her boots slipping in the snow, up the steep incline to the cave. Shadow, patient and steady, helped haul the larger pieces. Her muscles, already weak from hunger, screamed in protest. Her hands, still numb from the cold, blistered, then bled, then hardened into calluses. She worked from the first pale light of dawn until the blue twilight drove her back into the cave's shelter. Slowly, painstakingly, a structure took shape. It was not a pretty thing. The logs were uneven, the corners notched imperfectly. But it was solid. She used mud mixed with pine needles to chink the gaps between the logs, creating a seal against the drafts. For a roof, she split thin sections of cedar, but for the main covering, she found a better material. Further up the mountain, she discovered a seam of shale. The rock cleaved into thin, flat plates. She carried them down, load by load, and laid them as shingles for the roof of her small, interior shelter. They overlapped perfectly, creating a waterproof barrier, though inside the cave, rain was not the enemy. It was the slow, seeping dampness of melting snow at the entrance that she feared. While she built, she ate. She set snares for rabbits and squirrels, using tricks from one of her father's books. The first rabbit she caught felt like a feast. She ate every part of it, boiling the bones for a thin, nourishing broth. But her main source of food was still a dream. The potatoes. When the cabin was habitable, a single small room with a packed earth floor and a space for a fire, she turned her full attention to the primary task. She took the last of the money her father had hidden in a tin box, a few dollars and some coins, and rode Shadow for 2 days to a settlement in the next valley, a place where no one knew her name or her story. She walked into the general store, a thin, serious girl with old eyes, and spent every cent. Not on flour, or salt pork, or beans. She bought seed potatoes. 2 large sacks of them. The storekeeper gave her a strange look, but he took her money. Back at the cave, she prepared the ground. She had found a small, hidden meadow a quarter-mile from the cave, a bowl-shaped clearing that caught the sun for most of the day. The soil was rich and dark. All spring, she worked the earth, breaking it up with a sharpened stick, clearing the rocks, her hands raw and caked with dirt. She planted the seed potatoes with a reverence usually reserved for prayer. She talked to them, just as her father had, murmuring encouragement to the small, lumpy things that held the promise of her survival. The summer was a long, anxious vigil. She tended the plants, watering them with buckets hauled from a nearby stream, pulling weeds, watching for any sign of blight. She expanded her snares, learned to fish in the high-altitude streams with a simple line and hook. She was always hungry, but it was a working hunger now, not the desperate, empty hunger of that first week. And then, one day, an ally arrived. Her name was Bethany. She was an old woman who lived on the very edge of Providence Gulch, in a small cabin the other townsfolk avoided. They said she was strange, that she preferred the company of plants to people. Bethany had seen Audra ride out of the valley not with supplies, but with seed potatoes. Curiosity, a trait she shared with Audra's father, had prompted her to follow. She found Audra not starving or dead, but working. Bethany did not offer pity. She offered knowledge. She looked at the small cabin inside the cave, at the rows of thriving potato plants in the meadow, and she nodded, a small, approving gesture. She showed Audra which wild greens were still edible deep into the fall, how to make a tea from yarrow to fight a fever, how to create a poultice of comfrey for the stiffness in Shadow's old legs. She recognized in Audra something the town refused to see, competence. Bethany never stayed long, appearing silently every few weeks with a bundle of dried herbs or a piece of advice, then disappearing back down the mountain. She was a quiet, crucial thread connecting Audra to a world of knowledge that was not found in books. The harvest, when it came, was overwhelming. The plants had thrived in the mountain soil and sun. She dug them up by hand, revealing clusters of large, healthy potatoes. The yield was far greater than she had dared to hope. Now came the great labor. She had to move it all, every single potato, up to the cave. For weeks, that was her entire world. Dig, sack, load the sacks onto Shadow's back, and lead him up the steep path. Unload. Repeat. The pile of potatoes in the back of the cave grew and grew. It became a small mountain of sustenance, 2,000 pounds of her father's vindicated dream. Word of her strange project trickled back to Providence Gulch. A hunter, tracking a deer high on the slopes, saw her hauling the sacks. He told the story at Hemlock's store, a curious tale of the Mills girl living in a hole in the ground, hoarding potatoes. That is when the name was born. Potato Fool, it was said with a shake of the head, a mixture of pity and contempt. Mr. Hemlock scoffed from behind his counter. Wasting good spuds in a hole in the ground. She'll be begging at my door by first snow. The town settled into the comfortable certainty of her failure. It was a story they understood. The first snow came in late October, a heavy, wet blanket that buried the valley. For Audra, it was a moment of truth. She was sealed in her world of stone and earth. She built a fire in a small stove she had fashioned from a rusted iron barrel left by miners. The smoke drafted cleanly out of the cave mouth. She took one of the potatoes from the pile. It was cool and firm. There was no sign of frost, no hint of rot. The cave was working. The air, dry and still, held it in perfect stasis. She roasted the potato in the coals of her stove. The smell that filled her small cabin was rich and earthy. It was the smell of bread, of hearth, of safety. She ate it slowly, the flesh hot and floury. It was not just food. It was proof. Her father had been right. She had built her fortress not of wood or stone, but of knowledge. As the blizzard raged outside, burying the world in white, Audra Mills, the potato fool, was safe. And she was not hungry. The winter of 1878 arrived not as a season, but as a judgment. The early blizzard was followed by a stillness, a deep and penetrating cold that settled over the mountains and did not leave. The temperature stayed below zero for weeks. The wind stopped. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sharp crack of trees freezing and splitting in the forest. Providence Gulch was cut off. The pass was buried under 20 feet of snow. They were an island in a sea of white. At first, they were not worried. They had their stores. Smoked meat, barrels of cornmeal, sacks of dried beans. It was the food of survival, the food that had seen them through every other winter. But this winter was different. The unrelenting cold seemed to weaken the town's spirit, and then its bodies. A sickness began to move from house to house. It started as a dry cough, then settled deep in the chest, a wasting illness that stole the strength from men and the breath from children. They called it the winter lung. The people grew too weak to hunt. The cornmeal and beans, once staples, became hard to digest, a heavy burden on sickened stomachs. The town's physician, a man whose knowledge was limited to setting bones and delivering babies, had no remedy. People began to fade. Hunger was no longer a distant threat, it was a quiet, constant presence in every cabin. The children suffered most, their small bodies having no reserves to fight the cough and the cold. Mr. Hemlock watched the town he unofficially ran begin to fail. His own son, a boy of 9, was sick. The boy's breathing was a shallow rasp. He refused the corn gruel his mother tried to feed him. Hemlock's store was full of goods, but he had nothing that could truly help. His certainty, the rigid arithmetic by which he lived his life, was failing him. He had food, but not nourishment. Then, someone remembered the fool on the mountain. The story of the girl hoarding potatoes, once a source of amusement, was recalled in a different light. Potatoes. Easy to cook, soft, full of sustenance. A food for the sick. A food for children. It was a desperate hope, and it was the only one they had. Mr. Hemlock and another man, John Gable, set out at dawn. The journey was a brutal ordeal. They used snowshoes, sinking deep with every step. The cold was a physical thing, a presence that pressed in on them. When they finally reached the high slopes near the cave, they were exhausted, their faces rimed with ice. They found the cave mouth, a dark slash in the white landscape. A thin tendril of smoke rose from within. Hemlock called out her name. Audra? Audra Mills? She appeared at the entrance of her small cabin within the cave. She was not the gaunt, desperate creature they had expected to find. She was thin, yes, but her eyes were clear. She was wearing a coat patched with rabbit fur. She looked warm. She looked well. She held no weapon, only a quiet stillness. Mr. Hemlock was a man diminished. The journey, the cold, the fear for his son, it had stripped the arrogance from him. He seemed smaller than she remembered, his shoulders slumped inside his heavy coat. The hardness in his face had gone soft in the wrong direction, collapsing into lines of weariness and defeat. He did not apologize. He did not have the words for it. He spoke of the practical need, the only language he truly understood. "We have need of them," he said, his voice hoarse. "The potatoes. The town is sick." The children he could not finish. Audra looked at the two men, their chests heaving, their faces etched with desperation. She saw not the men who had scorned her father and cast her out. She saw men who were afraid for their families. There was no triumph in her, no flicker of satisfaction. Her father's books had taught her about soil and seasons, but his life had taught her that bitterness was a barren crop. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "How many sacks can you carry?" she asked. She led them into the depths of the cave. They stared at the mountain of potatoes, a fortune beyond imagining. It was perfectly preserved, a miracle of earth and air. She helped them fill their sacks, choosing the best ones. She showed them how to load their mule for the treacherous journey back. She refused their offer of payment, of future credit at the store. "Just get it to the children first," she said. As they were preparing to leave, Mr. Hemlock stopped. He fumbled inside his coat, his gloved fingers clumsy. He pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was her father's ledger, the one that had recorded all his theories, his planting dates, his small, hopeful calculations. Hemlock had taken it along with the cabin. He held it out to her. "This is yours," he said. He did not look her in the eye. It was not a full apology. It was a return piece of a man's soul, an admission that its value was not something that could be entered on a balance sheet. It was the costliest thing he could give. Audra took the book. She nodded once. "The path will be frozen solid by nightfall," she said. "You should hurry." That was her forgiveness. It was not a speech. It was a practical warning, an act of preservation. It was the only kind she knew how to give. The potatoes saved Providence Gulch. They were boiled, mashed, made into soups. They were the soft, warm nourishment that allowed the sick to regain their strength, that gave the children a fighting chance against the winter lung. No one ever called her potato fool again. They called the food she provided mountain provisions. Audra never moved back to the town. The cave was her home. But she was no longer an outcast. She was their lifeline. Every fall, the town would send a party up the mountain to buy her potatoes. She expanded her fields, using the techniques her father had only dreamed of. She became a teacher. Young people from the town, curious and respectful, would make the journey to her cave. She taught them not just how to grow potatoes, but how to read the land, how to understand the seasons, how to prepare for the unexpected. She taught anyone who came with an honest question. She lived this way for 50 more years. A quiet, competent woman of the mountain. She died on a Tuesday in January, seated in a simple wooden chair she had built herself, placed just inside the mouth of her cave. She was looking out at the falling snow. A cup of chicory tea, still warm, sat on a small table beside her. In her lap rested a small leather pouch filled with the best of last year's harvest, the seed potatoes for the coming spring. A young man she had trained, come to check on her as he did every week, found her there. She looked like a person who had just finished a long and satisfying book. Her legacy was not written in stone, but in the lives of the people she fed. She sustained a town of 150 people through 7 hard winters. She taught more than 40 children the principles of agriculture that transformed the valley from a place of precarious survival to one of modest prosperity. They buried her near the cave, and the headstone they carved had only 3 words. Audra Mills. She provided. You have a gift the world has called foolish. A quiet obsession, a strange competence, a knowledge that fits no existing category. You have been dismissed for it. You have been told it has no value. And so, you stand at the entrance to your own cave, a place of possibility the world cannot see. You are afraid to enter, afraid to fill it with the one thing you know how to grow. The earth does not judge what you plant. The mountain does not care what they call you. They only ask that you begin. That single potato she held in the cold was not just a root. It was a promise. Sometimes, the thing that saves us is the very thing we were condemned for loving. If these stories of quiet resilience are what you look for, subscribe, and we will explore another forgotten life next week.